So, Netflix have recently released their adaptation of the beloved 1998 anime Cowboy Bebop, and it's not very good. Whenever a studio announces a reboot or a remake of a beloved property, people always get up in arms and are worried it's going to be terrible. But I gave this one a fair shot, didn't make any judgments until I'd seen it, watched all 10 episodes before I started writing, and really I wasted my time. Everything I was worried about would happen did happen, and I should have saved myself those precious viewing hours. This video is going to be split into 3 broad sections. The first part will be based around the narrative and themes of the new show. The second part will be about characterization, casting choices, that sort of thing. And then the third part will be about the art direction, the art style, the sets, the presentation basically. Throughout this whole thing, I'm going to be comparing it to the original anime, and because I can't think of a clean way not to include spoilers, there's going to be a lot of spoilers for both the original anime and this new Netflix show. So if you don't like spoilers, you're probably just going to have to click off this video. I'm going to be referring to the new show as Netflix Bebop and the original as Cowboy Bebop, so I'll probably be saying Bebop a lot. The core plot premise of both Netflix Bebop and Cowboy Bebop is the same. A group of bounty hunters roam the universe looking for bad guys and getting into wild mishaps and rules. The crew consists of Spike Spiegel, Jet Black and Faye Valentine, all with their own baggage and stories, reluctantly working together to try and catch their quarry. Unfortunately, Netflix Bebop does not really focus on the bounty hunting aspect, instead becoming more of an action drama, especially in the later episodes. In the original series, we found out that Spike was previously a member of the Syndicate, which is some sort of shadowy universal criminal triad. We don't find out too much of what he did in the Syndicate, just getting very brief flashbacks of points throughout the series, some comments from his former associates, and really we are left to fill in the details ourselves. Netflix Bebop takes this plot point and makes it the main thread of the show. We are constantly told what Spike used to do, given extensive flashbacks and even an entire episode dedicated to his life in the Syndicate. This was a bad decision on the part of the writers of the new show. This decision to show and explain everything really weakens the show overall. The show is full of exposition and it's completely needless. We don't need to know every single detail of Spike's life in the Syndicate. We don't need to know what he used to do, why he did the things he did, how he grew up, or the fact that he was an orphan. The viewer is smart enough to fill in these gaps ourselves. In the anime, we can tell from Spike's reaction when he hears the name Julia or Vicious that they were big parts of his life, parts that he can't let go of. We don't need to necessarily know why or what happened between them, knowing that they were part of his previous life is enough. Netflix Bebop explains everything and adds in so much needless detail. Because they have decided to make Spike's dealings with the Syndicate a main plot point, it means that characters like Julia and Vicious are promoted from being side characters to being main characters, series regulars, with their story running along the whole show. There are often moments in Netflix Bebop where it almost feels as if it is starting to recapture some of the magic of the original, where they are having fun and it's getting exciting, before they decide to completely slow down the pacing and cut to this boring crime melodrama. We just didn't need all of this, and it weakens so much of the show's identity. Because Netflix Bebop spends so much time in the character's past, it never finds its footing in the present. In Cowboy Bebop, whenever the past catches up to the main characters, it's presented in a way that shows just a little, but not the full story. However, these episodes are not the norm. Most of them are the crew doing what they are supposed to do, i.e. bounty hunting. Netflix Bebop wastes so much of its time in this pointless melodrama that it leaves very little for what is supposed to be the main element of the show. For some reason, most of Netflix Bebop takes place on planets. I presume this was a budgetary decision, but the crew spends very little time in space. Space is just used as a way to get from point A to point B in Netflix Bebop, rather than being a setting of its own. So much of Cowboy Bebop was in space, and it's such a bizarre choice that they decided to remove this part of the show. Most of the action takes place on the ground, in regular buildings or boring settings. It just doesn't make sense. I had to flick back through the series to make sure I didn't miss anything, but there's genuinely no proper space chases or space action in the entire thing. Even when we see the swordfish be used, or the red tail, they're almost always on Earth, with just one singular scene where we see the swordfish be taken up into space. It's a monumental misfire to ground a series that's supposed to take place in space. There are even scenes where the crew are sitting around talking about their next mission or some sort of exposition, and they are sitting in the Bebop. Whenever this kind of shot happened in Cowboy Bebop, the Bebop would be moving, going to some unnamed planet. In Netflix Bebop, it's almost always docked, lifeless and stagnant. I'll talk a little bit more about artistic direction later, but the show doesn't use establishing shots very often, and when it does, it isn't usually clear what they're supposed to be establishing. This strangely makes a show that is supposed to be set across the whole universe feel like it's all taking place in one city. So for a show in which characters can be on completely different planets from one scene to the next, actually letting the viewer know where they're supposed to be would be a big help. Okay, I can't really talk about the story anymore without getting into the characters, so I'm going to have to blur the first two sections together a little bit. Let's start with an easy one, Jet Black. Jet Black is played by Mustafa Shakir, and I think he genuinely does a good job at playing the character. He gives Jet the right tone and gruff, and I think was a good casting choice. Unfortunately, the show does the character a disservice. Netflix Bebop makes a major change in Jet's backstory by giving him a daughter. Yes, a daughter. Jet has a daughter now. And that pretty much defines all of his character's actions. He became a bounty hunter to be able to buy nice things for his daughter. He needs to do a particular bounty to get her a birthday present. He needs to clear his name so that she will respect him. It's all about his daughter. Whilst in isolation this type of decision might make sense, it massively weakens the point of these characters. In Cowboy Bebop, Faye, Spike and Jet are all defined by their past in one way or another. They never really look towards the future, simply living in the present or looking backwards, unable to truly plan ahead. Yet Jet no longer fits in this category in Netflix Bebop, as there are completely rational reasons for everything he does. He's simply trying to work hard so he can end up giving his daughter a better life. He does not have a death wish and is always looking forward. This has a knock-on effect through his interactions with his crewmates, which I'll mention in a bit. Faye Valentine goes through probably the biggest change of the main crew. In Cowboy Bebop, she's someone that is constantly forced to do things just to survive, to outrun her debtors and people that are after her. She keeps people at an arm's length, doesn't trust anyone, but ultimately finds herself caring about her new family over the course of the full series. In both series, Faye has a similar backstory. She was involved in an accident when she was a teenager, put into cryostasis for decades, before being woken up with amnesia. She was lied to, manipulated, and ultimately set out into the galaxy with a load of debt, not knowing who she is, having to fend for herself. Cowboy Bebop takes a fair bit of time to explain all this, whilst Netflix Bebop just has Faye tell people her story sometimes. They go for a tell, don't show style with Faye, which is very odd, considering that they did the complete opposite with Spike, showing us every single part of his backstory. The weird part about Faye in Netflix Bebop is the way she's written. For some reason, they've decided to make her a sarcastic, sweary edgelord who seems to act like a disgruntled teenager mad at the world. In Cowboy Bebop, you get a real sense that Faye has deep pain inside her about not belonging anywhere, not trusting anyone, and not knowing why she is alive. In Netflix Bebop, you just don't feel that. Having Faye act out and moan doesn't convey this message at all, and it's a bizarre way to write her character. She's played by Daniela Pineda, who I think does alright. She isn't given much to work with though, so you don't really get to see what she could have done with the character. They changed her costume design slightly in order to make her not run around catching bounties half naked, and that makes sense. It's the type of thing that only really makes sense in fantasy video games and 90s anime. It would have just looked odd on screen. Netflix Bebop also made the decision to make Faye a lesbian, and whilst this change doesn't have any effect on the series, it actually leads to one of the only scenes in the show which I think worked really well for her character. There's a scene in which she has sex with a mechanic, and she tells her that because she's an amnesiac, that was her first time. She explains that because she can't remember her childhood, she has no frame of reference for anything, and things as simple as scraping her knee can be an ordeal because in her mind, that has never happened to her before. I think that is quite an interesting take on the amnesiac side of her character, that so much of what we as adults take for granted would be first-time experiences for her. It's a shame that after this scene and that bit of dialogue, Netflix Bebop just abandons this idea entirely. If they carried on with it throughout the show, having Faye discover things for the first time, it would have been a genuinely good way to show some character development. But they missed the mark again. They really should have done this because they took away some of her gambling addiction in the show, and we don't know anymore if she's still in serious debt or not. We don't really know the stakes of Faye's life, so giving her at least this would have kept her character interesting and giving her an arc. Now, let's get on to Spike Spiegel. Spike has been promoted to the main character of Netflix Bebop, and his story dominates the entire show. He is played by John Cho, and that was a point of contention I think for a lot of people when this casting decision was originally announced. Personally, I don't see a problem with casting Spike a little older than he was in Cowboy Bebop, as long as they adjust his character accordingly. Because Spike is now older than Jet, it affects how we the viewers see that dynamic, but the writers didn't really do anything with that. In Cowboy Bebop, Spike is portrayed as someone who seems to be uncaring, only doing things when he thinks it might be exciting, or to get something he wants, like some nice food. He seems to be a bounty hunter, purely because of the rush it can give him, and perhaps because he has a death wish and doesn't consider his current life as a life, but rather a dream. We do see throughout the series that he does have some sense of morality. He helps various people out of jams and when people close to him get hurt or die, he seems to be affected by it. A perfect example of this is the episode in Cowboy Bebop in which Spike meets a young man who's trying to look after his sister by stealing from criminals, and Spike reluctantly takes him under his wing. This man dies. Spike seems to be affected by the ordeal and tries to help out the man's sister, even though there is nothing in it for him. We don't really find out why he did this, and there's absolutely no relation to his past or other people he knows. We just see him do it, and are left to think about why ourselves. Netflix Bebop never does anything like this. It doesn't put the character through new experiences where we can see his morals. Everything has to relate back to his past or people he already knows. It is singularly focused on this one syndicate plot thread, and if I haven't said it enough, it bogs the show down and weakens it. It's as if Netflix Bebop does not trust the viewer to be able to work out why characters might do certain things without telling us. Apart from some brief cameos, Ed does not appear in the show, so the main crew ends up being Spike, Jet and Faye, as well as It Line, though Iron does not ultimately do very much in this version. Ed not being in Netflix Bebop creates somewhat of a narrative problem for the series. I know why they have excluded her. It's because this is Netflix and they want to make a load of different series rather than just tell one good story. But you can't just remove a core pillar without it having an effect. Ed serves a very specific function in Cowboy Bebop. Jet, Faye and Spike are all one way or another defined by their past. Jet seems to be living two lives, not knowing where this one will take him. Faye can't remember her past and just wants to know who she is. Spike seems to think his life is already over and every day is just an extension, overtime from his death. And when his past catches up to him, he treats it as an inevitability. Ed is the only character that doesn't have this label and actively lives in the present or looks to the future. Ed tracks down the Bebop and wants to become a member of its crew. Ed often just wants to have fun, and ultimately, Ed is the only character that leaves the Bebop to pursue a new future when she finds out her dad is still alive. For her, the Bebop was just a small part of her story, and she was going to continue down her own path. For the others, the Bebop was the end of their story. Removing Ed from this equation in Netflix Bebop means they have to come up with new reasons for the crew to look forward. This is probably why they did things like introduce Jet's daughter, but it ultimately never meshes very well. They made Jet the father figure of the group, and is given lots of pieces of dialogue where he talks about the crew as a family, or him and Spike as partners, saying partners should trust each other, that's what partners do, that kind of thing. And they gave him and Spike a bit of a bromance. They care about each other openly and help each other out all the time. Cowboy Bebop presents their relationship as a lot more nuanced. It's clear they have respect for each other, but Netflix Bebop makes them out to be in a buddy cop movie. I know why they did this, and I can explain it in 4 words: Guardians of the Galaxy. Netflix clearly saw the success of that property and wanted to make their own version, and saw Cowboy Bebop as the way to do it. Guardians only works because of the camaraderie and found family that the characters develop between them, so they had to inject that into Netflix Bebop in a much more obvious way. Doing this just changes the characters and what they mean to each other, and the show just doesn't make up for it. Finally, let's talk about the other characters that make up the show. Vicious and Julia are our main characters. As I mentioned previously, their story makes up quite a lot of the show's runtime. Vicious is played by Alex Hassel, and unfortunately, I don't think this role quite suits him. Instead of Vicious being a dark, twisted villain, Netflix Bebop just makes him a straight-up murderous thug, constantly gurning at the camera, twiddling his evil fingers, coming up with schemes. He could not be more of a stereotypical bad guy if they tried, and it really takes you out of any sense of immersion when this guy just walks on, looking like an anime cosplay character. His entire motivation seems that he wants to prove that he is man enough, whatever that means, by killing and clawing his way to the top. They add in all of this exposition and story to Vicious, but ultimately there is no additional substance. Netflix Bebop and Cowboy Bebop both contain Vicious wanting to kill Spike for acts in the past, wanting to take over the Syndicate, and being a ruthless villain. That's all that is needed. Anything else is just fluff, and it often feels like scenes with him are a completely different show. For Julia, they somehow made her more of a character, but less of a character at the same time. In Cowboy Bebop, she gets very little screen time, and just a mysterious feature of Spike's past. We see brief hints of a love triangle between her, Spike and Vicious, but it's never really elaborated on. It doesn't need to be. She acts as a conduit for story events, and we're left to make of her what we will. There is a scene in the anime in which Faye says that she is the dangerous kind of ordinary, and we as the viewer are probably meant to interpret that line as meaning that people project all of their own problems and ideals onto her, not letting her be a person in her own right. Netflix Bebop pretty much does the exact same thing, but takes a much longer time to show it. She has a few moments of agency here and there, but really she is still just a plot point, a way to create tension and drama, and a way to pull Spike back in. Oh, I forgot to mention that for some reason Spike's real name is now Fearless. Netflix Bebop explains the romance between Spike and Julia in so much detail that it actually doesn't make sense anymore why Spike is so affected by her. In Netflix Bebop, Spike looks after Julia whilst Vicious is off doing some murdering, and they end up having an affair. They then decide they will run away together, but unfortunately Vicious finds out and tries to kill Spike. We don't see any kind of long romance or deep connection between the two, just a fleeting fling. It then makes no sense why Spike is so attached to Julia, even 3 years after these events. In Cowboy Bebop, we have no clue what they went through together, or their past, so you can imagine any kind of backstory we like. Because Netflix Bebop has to explain everything, it no longer makes sense. Additionally, we do get some more incidental characters, and characters from the original series pop up in Netflix Bebop. A lot of the original villains and bounties come up in various forms: Hakim, Uday, Pierre LaFaux, and the stories are sort of similar but twisted slightly, and the way they twist most of them is to link in with the Syndicate again somehow, so that plot thread carries on throughout the entire show. Annie is now an owner of a jazz nightclub, which seems to act as some kind of hub for all the local criminals, whilst Gren is now a bartender. Annie fulfills sort of the same role in the story as she did in Cowboy Bebop, explaining to Spike some goings on in the Syndicate, but she has a much more active role in the story this time, rather than just some kind of informant. In Cowboy Bebop, Gren served a specific role in one specific episode to show that Vicious had much more of a backstory than we perhaps first understood. Gren was given experimental drugs and became intersex, but they don't really show that in Netflix Bebop. Gren is portrayed as being non-binary, but we don't get any additional backstory apart from that. I hope that if the show does have a series 2, Gren is kept as intersex, because there really isn't any intersex characters in anything, so for them to just get rid of this one wouldn't be a good thing. And if they wanted to have a character that was non-binary, just make a new one, because intersex and non-binary are not the same thing. One minor thing which I don't think can fit into anywhere else in this video is the strange changes in how technology is presented, and it often ends up being really anachronistic. Cowboy Bebop originally wasn't necessarily retro-futuristic, they were just imagining future technology using their own frames of reference. Netflix Bebop seems to have retro equipment readily on hand. For example, when Faye gets a VHS of her past, yes, VHS now rather than Betamax, they have a video player just ready to go. In the original series, there was a whole episode dedicated to them having to track down one singular video player from an old museum, but that kind of thing is just normal in this one. It also takes a lot of inspiration from Blade Runner, strangely enough. Animals are really expensive and very few people have them, with almost all meat being synthetic. They also lift the Tears in Rain speech directly and give it to Pierre LaFaux for no reason whatsoever. Okay, now I want to talk about art direction, how the series looks and is presented. So this was probably my biggest disappointment with Netflix Bebop, and it's the fact that the show just looks so flat. I was hoping that even if the story wasn't great, at least it would be a pretty show to look at, but it really isn't, it just looks bad. A lot of this seems to come down to the lighting. Everything is just so bright in so many scenes that it ends up looking like a soap opera TV show rather than a cinematic space adventure. It takes away any sense of atmosphere, and that's what this show lacks, atmosphere. Earlier on, I said that the show often felt like it all took place on the same planet, and a lot of that has to do with the set design. Take a look at this church scene. Doesn't this look like a scene from Earth? Now let's look at this house where Jet's daughter lives. It could have been plucked from any modern TV show. This building site might be the worst example. They all have 90s PCs, even paper and cardboard files sitting behind them. It's as if they just went down to a local construction and asked to film, not bothering to change a thing. It looks really bad. It makes the characters look out of place too. There are quite a lot of scenes where only Spike and Jet are wearing their anime character uniforms, and everyone else is either dressed in regular modern clothing, or some sort of 70s disco throwback outfit. They stick out like a sore thumb, and it makes it seem like they're on their way to a cosplay convention, rather than actual parts of this world. Nobody else dresses like them, so their outfits make no sense. You can't just pluck things from the anime without plucking all of it. So having their costumes in isolation, compared to how everyone else looks, just doesn't work. Take Jet's beard for example. I would have had no problem with them just giving Jet a regular human beard, but instead they've stuck with the pointy anime version, and it never ever looks natural. The show clearly had some good budget behind it, but some of the sets are just so drab. The series opens up in a casino, and we would compare this directly to the casino from Cowboy Bebop. In Netflix Bebop, there's a handful of people in a small room with a few machines around the back, nothing going on. It looks really boring and could have been shot in any 70s American hotel, rather than this epic space show. In Cowboy Bebop, the casino has hustle and bustle, has scale to it, It looks like it is in outer space in the future, not some random room. There's another scene in Netflix Bebop which is set in what looks like a hotel lobby, but I think it's supposed to be a restaurant, just in some street in the middle of nowhere where eco-terrorists attack. Compare this to the floating space restaurant in Cowboy Bebop, which sets the scene and atmosphere perfectly. If I could think of another word for atmosphere I would, but I'll say it again for good luck. Netflix Bebop has no atmosphere. For some unknown reason, the show is absolutely littered with Dutch angles, which is just so disorienting. I think the cinematographer realised this show didn't have any style, so they tried to give it some with this technique, but it didn't work. This lack of atmosphere and style leaks into the action scenes. In Cowboy Bebop, the action is slick and cool. Spike fights like water, all bendy and fluid. In Netflix Bebop, they basically made Spike Neo from the Matrix. The way he fights is like Neo, and there are some quite bad looking stunts, clearly on wires, that make it seem as if Spike is the one. It isn't edited great either, it ends up lacking any real impact, with Spike seemingly wailing on guys for ages, without doing any actual damage. If it wasn't enough that it was shot poorly, the CGI is often quite ropey. I can see why they didn't shoot too much in space, or there are some scenes that just look bad, no way around it. When the show does decide to give us establishing shots of planets, they can look really great. It's one of the few things they really could have improved on over Cowboy Bebop. Cowboy Bebop had some early 3D in it, and looks really bad, so Netflix Bebop could have at least got that part right. I know I've already said that everything looks like it takes place on regular old Earth, but that is an issue that never goes away. I'm going to cycle through some screenshots of the series, and I can guarantee that if you didn't know these took place on another planet, you would think they was just random shots from any old movie. They don't do anything to give these places character, and it really harms the overall aesthetic. After finishing this show, I reflected on the experience I had. I'm a huge fan of Cowboy Bebop, and it was just really sad that they bungled this attempt at bringing it into live action. It worries me that so many people will watch this and perhaps be turned off from ever watching the anime original. The show just does not have the witty, fun aspect that the original had. It doesn't have those moments of the crew going all across the universe, chasing down bounties. It doesn't have those moments of them getting into serious mishaps and troubles, and it just isn't cool. You'll notice I haven't spoken about the music, and that's for a good reason. The music is just not a big part of Netflix Bebop. It's there in the background, but that's it. It isn't thematically important anymore. There's a strange mix of pieces playing straight out of the anime and new stuff. It doesn't gel very well. Playing a memorable piece of music is nice, but if it doesn't fit what we are seeing, then why bother? Overall, what do I have to say about Netflix Bebop? It's not very good. It's bad and I don't like it. I sat through and watched the whole thing, and I can only think of one scene that I actually liked. There was this bit where Jet is watching his daughter's dance recital in a small shop through a hologram device, so he's standing up and dancing along with her, whilst in the background Spike is beating up a load of bad guys on his own, so that Jet can watch his daughter's recital in peace. Those sort of hijinks are few and far between in Netflix Bebop, but I thought that was actually a bit of fun. I honestly think that if they'd cut out the entire Syndicate backstory, shortened each episode to about 30 minutes, tightened up the establishing shots, added in some more bounty hunting and space action, and focused on the fun parts, then the show could have had a shot at being good. There will inevitably be a second series, so maybe they can do better, but I wouldn't hold my breath.